Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Lee Pfeffer. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the manager of museum experience at the GLBT Society, and I'm here to introduce tonight's event and speaker. But first, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the GLBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous people. Today's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website, and we're also live streaming to our Facebook page. If you're watching live with us, we welcome your active participation in the forum, so we encourage you to post comments and discussions in the chat and ask questions for our speaker during our Q&A segment. Before we start and introduce our speaker tonight, I just wanted to give you a little bit of history about the Society. Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, or GLBT Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public knowledge and materials to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites: the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located since 2011 in the heart of San Francisco's Castro neighborhood, and the Dr. John P. DiCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. Our museum has now reopened to the public after a 6-month closure, and you can go check out tickets online. And even though our archives remain closed, please check out our growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources at our website, glbthistory.org. And finally, I would like to thank all of our members and donors who make all of our work possible. If you're not already a donor, or a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, please consider joining today. Members get a whole bunch of neat perks, including a 20% discount on purchases of cool swag from our online store. And so now I would love to introduce you tonight to our event. We are doing a talk called Paper Bullets, How Two Lesbian Artists Defied the Nazis. And our speaker for this evening is Jeffrey H. Jackson, who is a professor of history at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. An expert on European history and culture, he is the author of Paris Underwater, How the City of Light Survived the Great Flood of 1910, and Making Jazz French, Music and Modern Life in Interwar Paris. He has appeared in documentary films and helped develop Harlem in Montmartre, a Paris jazz story for PBS's great performancers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and welcome him into the stream with us today. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Lee. How are you? Thanks so much for that great introduction. I really appreciate it. And good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is part of my national book tour, my virtual book tour that I'm doing for Paper Bullets. And so I'm glad you could tune in. I'm coming to you live from my office on the beautiful campus of Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. Of course, I wish I could be with you tonight in person. I wish we could all be in person tonight, but thanks to the magic of the internet, perhaps more of us can get together than we could otherwise. So thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a powerful story about resistance and perseverance in the face of grave danger that forms the heart of my book, Paper Bullets. And it's a true story. And I'll read some selected excerpts from the book just to give you a sense of how I tell this story. I've lightly edited each of these excerpts tonight just for clarity. As I talk, you can put questions in the comments in the chat, and we will hopefully get around to those at the end. We may not be able to answer all of them, but we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have. I also want to say a special thank you to the folks at Dog-Eared Books Castro. They're the official bookseller for this event, wonderful local bookstore in San Francisco. They're selling some signed copies. So if you're interested, you can go and check that out. And Lee's put the information there on the screen. that you can find out more. And of course, you can order the book from many places, both in person and online, including Apple Books, where Paper Bullets was named one of the best books for the month of November. But it's always great to help support a local bookseller, local independent bookseller like Dog-Eared Books Castro. So what I want to do then is begin by introducing you to two remarkable women. You see them there on your screen. And if you know something about art, and especially the history of photography, you may have heard of them before. But even if you know their work, you may not know much about the story of how and why they fought the Nazis for 4 years. Now, their story has inspired me, and it's inspired lots of other people that I've talked to about it over the years. And so I'm really glad to be able to share it with you tonight. Meet Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, two of the most unlikely Nazi fighters that most of you probably never have heard of. They were Parisian artists. Lucy was a writer. Suzanne was an illustrator who had studied in art school when she was young. Together, the two of them collaborated on what many people in their own day saw as some sometimes shocking photographs. They were friends with and influenced by many of the great modern artists in Paris of their day: Picasso, André Breton, Salvador Dali, Jean Cocteau. But their images, these photographs, turned ideas of gender and identity on their head. And more than anything, that's what they're known for today. And if you do know them, of course, you know them by some different names: Claude, Cahun, and Marcel Moore. And I'm going to say more about that in their names in just a moment. But after they left Paris and after they left the art world behind, they put their skills as artists to work, fighting against the German army on the island of Jersey, one of the British Channel Islands. They used their creative powers to get inside the heads of the soldiers. In brief, here's how it worked. Lucy and Suzanne essentially created a PSYOPS campaign, or a psychological operations campaign, designed to demoralize the soldiers, telling them that the war was a lost cause and trying to convince them to go home to their families. And they did it in a very unexpected way, with notes and messages, summaries of BBC News reports, drawings, songs, bawdy jokes, and provocative slogans, all written or typed on little slips of paper like the one you see on your screen. And they left these notes around the island of Jersey for the Germans to find. In some cases, they even put their notes directly into the pockets of the soldiers themselves. And I want to begin reading the first excerpt here that I'm going to read is the opening scene of the book, where they are in the act of distributing these notes. On the morning of July 25th, 1944, Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe went into Saint-Hélier to do some shopping. The trip was part of their regular routine. Outside the offices of the Jersey Evening Post, they glanced up at the large clock at the top of the building. Suzanne leaned in and whispered to Lucy to keep watch. Then Suzanne scanned the long row of police cars the Nazi occupation forces always parked along Charles Street, a reminder of how heavily the Germans censored the island's only newspaper. Suzanne took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and began moving carefully toward one of the police cars as Lucy stood by on lookout duty. Suzanne stuck the gummed paper on the windshield. It read, "The cowardly bureaucrats of the police who live on lies and shameful cruelty will be destroyed by the soldiers with no names." No one seemed to be paying any attention to the middle-aged women in Burberry trench coats with bright scarves tied around their heads. Suzanne quickly attached papers to a few more windshields and casually strolled away, her Wellington boots thumping on the pavement. If anyone asked the women what they were doing, their shopping bag would provide a ready alibi. After finishing their secret mission, along with some mundane errands, they met up with their housekeeper, Edna, and boarded one of the wood-burning buses to head back home on the other side of the island. Lucy held a package of cigarette papers they had bought at the newsstand. These papers were destined to become a new batch of notes for the Nazis. In her pocket, alongside more of their notes, Suzanne could feel the bright blue milk of magnesia bottle. It did not contain the digestive medicine, however, but instead an overdose of the powerful barbiturate Gardinol, in case the Germans caught them in the act. With no warning, the bus came to an abrupt halt, and a fair-haired soldier climbed aboard. Everyone off the bus. Lucy clutched her parcel a bit tighter. Outside, the soldier approached each commuter. Suzanne noticed his bright blue eyes. "Please show me your papers. How old are you? What is your occupation? Where were you born? Where do you live? How many children do you have?" With his critical eye, the German carefully looked over each passenger's documents until satisfied, saying very little other than what was necessary to get his answers. If something was suspicious, or if passengers had forgotten their documents, they were told, "Someone will visit you in your home." Then the soldier approached Lucy and Suzanne. Lucy recalled the scene several years later in a scrapbook of notes that might have formed the basis of a memoir if she had lived long enough. She titled these reminiscences "The Mute in the Middle of the Muddle." "Show me your registration card," the German demanded. He stood in front of Lucy, glaring at her. A look of recognition crossed his face when he saw a familiar name, Schwob. What kind of name is that? The document listed French as her national origin. She explained nervously that she was an orphan and raised by a Frenchman. "Perhaps you were an Alsatian." "Maybe," she replied, but admitted that she didn't really know. Lucy stated that she had been on Jersey for some 30 years. Nearly everything she had just told the German about herself was a calculated lie. She invented a new backstory for herself, and not for the first time. As the minutes ticked by, Lucy waited patiently next to the bus and watched the soldier scrutinize her documents. Suzanne and Edna were close by but could do nothing to help. Lucy, perhaps coughing or stumbling a bit, played sick for the German's benefit, brushing off her acting skills from her Paris days when she took part in avant-garde theater productions. Finally, the soldier handed back Lucy's papers. When he wrapped up his examination of all the passengers, everyone reboarded the bus. An acquaintance riding with them tried to break the nervous tension created by the ordeal. "They have not caught you this time," she said, laughing, unaware of what Lucy's parcel of cigarette papers was destined for. Now, I'm going to tell you more about how they did all of this in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about their background, because one of the questions that I had to ask myself and think a lot about as I did this research was, why would two women with so much to lose put their lives on the line in the way that they did? And I also asked myself, what was it about who they were that gave them the strength and the power to become resistors during World War II? After all, most people did not become resistors during the war. Well, part of the answer, I think, lies in their personal histories. Lucy and Suzanne grew up around the turn of the 20th century in the southern French city of Nantes as daughters of wealth and privilege. Lucy's father was a newspaper owner and editor, and Suzanne's was the head of the medical school and a well-known physician. So they were never starving artists, even when they moved to Paris as young women in their 20s, just after World War I, to pursue their artistic careers, because they always had family resources. One reason they did not become famous in their day, even in the art world, is that they never really needed to publicize their work in order to make money. Now, they were known in certain circles, such as among the surrealists with whom they were close friends, but for decades they were largely forgotten until being rediscovered in the 1980s. Yet to become resistors, they would need to give up that privilege and the comfort that they were born with. But why would they? Well, I think there were some key things about their life stories which, although they didn't know it at the time, would set the stage for their resistance against the Nazis. First of all, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. Although he was assimilated and didn't practice the faith, Lucy embraced elements of her Jewish identity that were taught to her by her grandmother. There were also several rabbis and scholars of Jewish life in the family. Lucy was 4 years old at the height of one of the worst anti-Semitic episodes in modern French history, the Dreyfus Affair. Now, that's a complicated story, and I don't have time to go into it in detail tonight, but suffice it to say that it led to crowds outside the family's apartment shouting, "Down with the Jews." Later, when Lucy was 12, she was attacked by other children in school who pelted her with rocks and anti-Semitic taunts while she lay helpless on the ground. Lucy and Suzanne would both would remember those horrible days, and the memory would fuel their hatred of fascism and their willing to fight it. A second factor that allowed them to become resistors was the fact that they were in love. Lucy and Suzanne had met as young girls in the elite society, the elite circles of Nantes society, and they had played together from childhood. By the time they were teenagers, they began a relationship that was in tension with a conservative French Catholic society that valued respectability. Most people in France at the turn of the century did not see a lesbian couple as respectable. Their connection was made even more complicated by the fact that in 1917, Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother, making the girls stepsisters. But their feelings were powerful. Lucy wrote in a thinly veiled article published in a Nantes-based literary journal that her feelings for Suzanne were her idée maîtresse, her main idea, and that they were her guiding principle. "I am in her, she is in me, and I will follow her always, never losing sight of her." And you can see in this image here that's on your screen that Lucy drew. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but you can see their initials at the top, LS, Lucy Schwob, and SM, Suzanne Malherbe, that have been run together and sort of pushed together into one set of three letters, LSSM. When you read that phonetically in French, it creates the sentence elles s'aiment, which means they love each other. So drawing on their own experiences, Lucy and Suzanne also explored gender and sexuality as fluid and changing categories. This is one of the things that they're most famous for today. And in fact, they're not known in the art world as Lucy and Suzanne, but rather by the gender-neutral artistic names which they took, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. I should point out that really her name is pronounced Claude Cahun in French, but most English speakers, especially in the United States, tend to pronounce it Cahun. So I'll probably use that American pronunciation tonight just for clarity. They assume these names, Cahun and Moore, to create new identities and also to cross gender lines. Claude in particular is a name that's used by both men and women in French. Cahun put it this way in a memoir that she published in 1930. She wrote, "Masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillation." Gender was for Cahun situational, conditional, fluid, depending on the moment. Lucy's new name also allowed her to express her Jewishness. In fact, this new name, Cahun, was as much about Jewishness as it was about gender. Cahun was the name of one set of Lucy's grandparents, in particular, the grandmother who taught her about Judaism. Cahun is the French version of Cohen, the Hebrew word for priest. Like many other artists of their day, they created work under these new names, but these identities also allowed the women to slip the trap of bourgeois society. Yet throughout their lives, they always still called one another Lucy and Suzanne, and the historical documents are pretty clear on that point. We tend to call them Cahun and Moore throughout their lives because we know them from their art. But the documents reveal a much more complicated situation and a much more fluid situation when it comes to their names, kind of switching back and forth frequently between Cahun and Moore and Lucy and Suzanne. And I can talk more about that later on if you'd like. But Lucy and Suzanne are also the names on their tombstone. If you have seen their work under the names Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, you know of the ways in which their photographs depict Cahun, Lucy, in gender-ambiguous dress or pose, playing with notions of masculinity and femininity, in some ways helping to invent the notion of what we would now call queerness long before our current understanding of that idea was created. In fact, many queer and transgender people today see them as early heroes and as role models. Their photos deconstructed gender categories, showing them to be masquerade and performance decades before most scholars would take up these questions. Cahun put it this way in her autobiography: "I shave my head, wrench out my teeth, my breasts, anything that is embarrassing or annoying to look at, stomach, ovaries, the brain, conscious and covered in cysts," suggesting that altering gender and sexual identity was part of the goal, and so was creating a new self. The musician David Bowie, well known for his own gender ambiguity, mentioned a 2007 show that he saw of Cahun and Moore's photography. He talked about it on his blog, and he wrote, "I find this work really quite mad in the nicest way." That ability to cross gender lines would also become crucial to Lucy and Suzanne's fight against the Nazis. Lucy and Suzanne spent the 1920s and most of the 1930s in Paris, but they decamped to the island of Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, in 1937, when they were both in their late 40s. They had vacationed on Jersey many times over the years, so its beaches and its natural beauty were very familiar to them. And I'll say, as a personal note, I spent some time on Jersey doing the research for this book, and I can completely understand why they would want to move there. It's a beautiful place. The beach that you're seeing here on the screen is the beach right outside their home, and there's their home there on the left-hand side of the screen. It's a very lovely place to be. It was also a perfect respite for Lucy's chronic ill health. She had a number of medical conditions through which Suzanne had helped to nurse her over the years. And Paris had become deeply politically polarized by the 1930s, with various groups literally fighting in the streets. And with fascism on the rise across Europe, Jersey offered a peaceful escape. So when they left Paris, and then when they left the art world behind, they also stopped using the names Cahun and Moore, and returned almost exclusively to their birth names, Lucy and Suzanne. And that's part of why I refer to them as Lucy and Suzanne in the book, is because I'm primarily dealing with their post-Paris years when they had gone back almost entirely to Lucy and Suzanne. They really only continue to use Cahun and Moore later in life when they're corresponding with friends back in Paris. Little did they know, though, that when they moved to Jersey, they were stepping into what would soon become a war zone. When the fighting broke out in Poland in 1939, Jersey seemed far away from the action, but by 1940, the Channel Islands would become the front lines. In fact, the islands were the only piece of British soil that the Nazis conquered, and they were crucial to what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall, a line of defense in the West that was designed to keep the Allies at bay. Thousands of troops soon arrived in Lucy and Suzanne's adopted home to build fortifications, which would be used to protect the continent from Allied assault. It was so important that Hitler personally received regular updates from the islands. No dissent could be tolerated in such a strategically important location. But dissent is exactly what Lucy and Suzanne did. Back in Paris, they had been involved in left-wing politics, befriending communists and other radicals. They had signed petitions and open letters against the rise of fascism and protesting anti-immigrant legislation. Lucy had written a letter to a magazine supporting gay rights. So by the time they arrived on Jersey, they had been rebels for some time. Add to that their own lives as lesbian partners lived in opposition to the mores of their day and their provocative artwork that challenged notions of beauty and gender identity. Ultimately, all of the strands of their lives came together to not only give them the strength to resist the German occupation of Jersey, but to give them the skills to do so. They put their creative talents, their political inclinations, and their personal backgrounds into their work, and it gave them the tools to fight back. Resistance was not an afterthought, but the peak and the point of their creative lives. Most importantly, their love kept them going as they supported one another through what were some very scary and some very stressful moments. I really don't believe that either woman alone could have done this work. I think just like their art, all of which was collaborative, their resistance was something that came out of their relationship and out of their love. Now, as I said before, their desire to resist led them to write notes to the Nazis, something that on the face of it seems small and even inconsequential. But the notes they wrote were powerful indeed. All of these messages were designed to demoralize the troops, or to convince them to desert, or to mutiny, or to go back to their families in Germany. And the German army took them very seriously. For 4 years, the secret field police, which was the organization tasked with keeping order in occupied territories, they tracked them, trying to find out who was leaving all of these notes around the island. Sometimes the agents would find these notes on a fence post, sometimes on a cafe table, sometimes tucked into magazines in the newsstands, sometimes placed inside a German staff car parked along the street, and sometimes even in their own pockets. The women even hung a sarcastic banner over the altar at the church near their house where some of the soldiers worshipped, reading, "Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people die for Hitler." What they were doing with these messages, the banner and the notes, was scaring the German command into believing that a conspiracy was afoot on the island, this strategically important zone about which Hitler received regular updates. Was there someone on the island threatening the Atlantic Wall that protected Hitler's conquered continent from Allied attack? These notes and messages only stoked the Germans' paranoia. And now I want to read a second excerpt from the book. This is the scene where they are arrested. During a quiet dinner, a fist pounded at the door. It was the moment Lucy and Suzanne had been expecting every day for nearly 4 years. The only question was whether the Germans were clever enough to have discovered the women on their own, or if someone had ratted them out. Suzanne got up from the table, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Having studied these men carefully from afar for a long time, Lucy and Suzanne knew that they would not be smiling. 5 men stood on their doorstep, including the chief of the secret field police, Captain Boda, and a fair-haired man with bright blue eyes, who wore mustard-colored +4s. Suzanne greeted them with a simple good evening. With a surprising graciousness, the fair-haired man clicked his heels and made a deep, respectful bow from the hips. "German secret police," Suzanne remembered him announcing politely. "We come to search your house." Boda strode to the window seat and made himself comfortable, perhaps puffing on his cigar, while the fair-haired man, whom the others called Karl, started to run excitedly back and forth throughout the house. They ransacked every corner, pulling out all the drawers, prying into every nook and cranny of Lucy and Suzanne's lives. From his perch, Boda watched with suspicion as the 2 tired women, their faces slightly wrinkled and hair graying, stood by. "Too late," Lucy announced in English, knowing that these men did not speak French and herself unable to speak much German. "Germany has already lost the war," she proclaimed. Lucy and Suzanne remained calm, but their maid, Edna, panicked as the men ravaged the house. She knew everyone in the household had been breaking German regulations by hoarding food. Perhaps she worried that she had let something slip about the illegal radio. Carl came over to Lucy and stared down at her. "And what do you think will happen to you? You tell me that," he shouted, his calm and polite demeanor at the door now gone as the adrenaline from the thrill of the chase pumped through him. "I think probably you will torture us and shoot us afterward," Lucy replied flatly, as though she had always known and accepted that this would be the outcome. Carl was stunned silent. These women were not hysterical or even surprised by a raid on their house, but were already anticipating their own deaths. I believe until that moment he had thought us unaware of the risks we had been taking, Suzanne reflected. Carl looked at Boda, then back at Lucy and Suzanne. "But we never do that kind of thing," he proclaimed indignantly. "That is BBC propaganda." Lucy glanced back at him, raising her eyebrow in disbelief. Now, the notes that frightened the Germans the most, like the one you see on your screen, were the ones that Lucy and Suzanne signed. But they did not sign them with their own name. Instead, they signed them with the name of an author that they had invented. They created a fictional persona and pretended to write messages from that perspective in German, since Suzanne was fluent. But the persona was significant. They called him the soldier with no name. In other words, they crossed gender lines once again, this time in effect becoming, so to speak, a German soldier. When they wrote notes in this male German voice aimed at the other soldiers, they made the secret police believe that the threat was coming from within the German army itself. This was one of their innovations. Note writing was not unique to them. There are many cases of people living in German-occupied territory, and even within Nazi Germany itself, writing notes as a form of dissent. But most of these notes were aimed at the civilian population, reminding them to keep their spirits up or calling on them to resist the Nazis. As far as I can tell, Lucy and Suzanne were unique as civilians aiming their notes at the German soldiers themselves. The only real parallel, I think, was the Allied PSYOPS campaign, which dropped German language leaflets behind enemy lines, encouraging soldiers to desert or to surrender. What Lucy and Suzanne were doing was rewriting the inner script, or what the political theorist James C. Scott calls the hidden transcript, that the Germans told themselves about how the war was going. They were getting inside the minds of the soldiers and sowing seeds of doubt and dissension, spreading ideas that they hoped would go viral, so to speak. Someone I was talking with recently actually likened them to internet memes that circulate. So if a German read their notes, signed by the soldier with no name, and believed that they really were written by a comrade, Lucy and Suzanne hoped that he might think twice about what he was doing on Jersey. Maybe he would even mutiny or desert. Now, of course, I don't have time to tell you the whole story tonight, but suffice to say that they were indeed arrested by the secret field police, as we heard in the last excerpt. They were interrogated. They were put on trial on November 16th, 1944, 76 years ago next week. And then they were sent to prison and they were sentenced to death. And so the next excerpt from the book that I want to read is a scene from their trial. The judges and lawyers convened in large imitation leather armchairs on one side of the table. Lucy and Suzanne's chairs, placed opposite the Germans, were so large that the women could not use the armrests without spreading themselves unnaturally wide, so Suzanne rested her hands in her lap. Lucy, thinned by illness and lack of nourishment, was curled up in one corner of her chair like a child who climbed in a seat made for a large adult. Behind them were two rows of spindly gilt cane chairs. Captain Boda, wearing a white jacket and smoking his cigar, balanced on one of them. On a table lay all the items confiscated during the raid on their house, including their Philips radio, their Underwood typewriter, and their Kodak camera. 2 guns, books, articles published by Lucy's father, one of Suzanne's wooden crosses that Lucy had planted on a soldier's fresh grave, pieces of fabric, and a few of the coins on which the women had painted "Down with War" in nail polish. These once familiar things now seemed strange, so out of context, in a courtroom rather than at home. This collection looks like a sort of junk shop, Lucy Riley thought. Also on the table sat Boda's fat file, which was packed with their notes. The approximately 300 scraps of paper now entered into evidence were only a fraction of what they had produced, 1/20th, Lucy claimed. Her estimate was different from what Suzanne recalled, but of course neither had really been counting. The other noteworthy feature in the room was the 3/4 length portrait of Hitler that hung over the fireplace. He appeared to be presiding over the trial. Lucy recalled the large windows of the courtroom filled with the sunshine from the beautiful day outside. even describing the room as hot. What a luxury, she thought, compared with their cold prison cells. 2 large, comfortable armchairs in the front row next to one another. What a delight. We are at the show, Lucy remembered with more than a bit of sarcasm. The decor, the actors did not disappoint us. Rather than reading the indictment or inviting the prosecutor to begin, the chief judge, Oberstabsrichter Harmsen, began by questioning Lucy and Suzanne in German about their responses during their interrogations. Then he asked about some of the evidence he felt had been ignored, peppering the women with a string of additional queries. Any previous convictions? Harmsen asked. Have you ever appeared before a court? Never, Suzanne answered in German, speaking for both herself and for Lucy. Harmsen turned the proceedings over to the prosecutor, Lieutenant Lung, so that he could make the formal case against the women, and for the next few hours, he did just that. Lung began by focusing on several of their leaflets and messages to the German troops. One of those was their darkly funny version of a heroic song. The interrogator had asked them about it, and Suzanne had not denied that it crudely shamed German women and embarrassed German men. Lung read the song in its entirety to the court. The refrain joked, "And when I came home on leave, my wife was pregnant. Don't be cross, my little boy," she said. "The fatherland needs soldiers." "This is an insult to German womanhood," Harmsen declared. One of the other judges, deeply offended, refused to look at Lucy and Suzanne. "By no means," Suzanne protested. "I have simply tried to show the kind of situation that would arise if a woman actually followed the directives of the party." The men at the table sat silently as Harmsen nervously shuffled his papers. "Perhaps I should have made it clear that the father of the many children the song went on to mention was always an Aryan," she quipped slyly. Harmsen put the leaflet down and picked up another. When it came time to pass sentence, Harmsen was blunt. "You are franc-tireur," he declared, using the French term for guerrilla fighters or irregular military shooters, even though you used spiritual arms instead of firearms. He gave a brief summary on why their actions were so significant and why he had condemned them as dangerous political criminals. "It is indeed a more serious crime," he claimed. "With firearms, one knows at once what damage has been done, but with spiritual arms, one cannot tell how far-reaching it may be." Lucy could not help but think, we couldn't have put our defense any better ourselves. Now, even during their time in prison, the women kept up their efforts at defying the Nazis. As they befriended guards, they passed notes and comforted other prisoners, many of whom were on their way to be executed. The book is full of surprising episodes of what took place in those moments behind bars. German guards, both frightening and humane, prisoners keeping up one another's spirits with singing in the middle of the night, Lucy and Suzanne smuggling notes to one another, tales of German deserters being hauled off to their execution, leaving the women to wonder when their turn before the firing squad would come. But there's one story in particular that stands out because I think it highlights how important their relationship, their love story, was to making all of this happen. As Lucy was being interrogated by the secret police, she made a stunning admission. She blurted out, "I am on my father's side of Jewish origin." She admitted to being an unregistered Jew living in Nazi-occupied territory, thereby putting herself in grave danger. Then she confessed to the supposed crime, telling her investigator that she wrote all the notes by herself and that the whole thing was her idea. She was trying to convince her interrogators that she alone had the motive to become the soldier with no name. But in reality, she was not claiming credit for their work as the true mastermind behind the campaign, as some scholars have believed in the past. In fact, Lucy knew just how much of their resistance Suzanne was responsible for. Lucy herself wrote that it was more often me who accompanied Suzanne, she who took the initiative, which required the most sang-froid. Instead, Lucy's calculated risk in admitting her Jewishness was an attempt to take the fall and save Suzanne. If the police believed that Lucy alone had a motive to write their notes, then the woman she loved might somehow get off. Lucy and Suzanne survived the war, but they had to work hard to make sense of it. What had it all meant? After all, they did not drive the Germans from Jersey with their notes. But in some very important, very personal ways, their effort was a success. And it's something that I think speaks to us today about the power of creativity and imagination and persistence, especially in trying times. I think in a lot of ways they've left us with a story about how even small acts of protest and refusal can have significant effects that are sometimes hard to see until later. And they also remind us why history matters, because in the midst of our present day difficulties, a pandemic, deep political polarization, economic uncertainty, we can look back to the stories of people who had it far worse, but still somehow survived. So I want to close with a final excerpt from the book where I talk about how Lucy and Suzanne tried to make sense of what they had gone through. After the war, one day in Saint-Hélier, Lucy and Suzanne encountered a woman whom they had never met before. She stopped them and proclaimed, "I'm so happy to see you alive." Several others also gathered around to greet Lucy and Suzanne. They were in disbelief to learn that the women had survived their ordeal. It must have been a dreadful experience. The woman continued, "Now you must forget all about it." Lucy and Suzanne were left dumbfounded by her blithe advice. Later, Lucy sat on her bed, leafing through a stack of papers. Next to her, on a small table where she placed her tea tray, sat the square hat box one of the German guards had given to her last August as a place to keep her personal items. Other than her memories, the miscellaneous mementos inside this box were all she had left of their months behind bars. "Of all our baggage," she said, "the hat box was the only one that had any value." She determined that she would organize all the prison communications, letters, drawings, notes, between her and Suzanne. Few of the documents from their earlier lives had survived the occupation of their home by the Germans. She speculated that the soldiers had used them to light fires in the fireplace. Lucy gave some papers to a friend on Jersey, and she sent a few other items to friends back in Paris, but the ones with the most personal meaning did not leave that box. The memories were too precious. When Lucy couldn't sleep, she reread the notes that Suzanne had written to her during their prison stay, some of them on sanitary napkins, and felt strangely nostalgic. But as the days went on, her thoughts began to darken. Lucy had always been the more pessimistic of the two, prone to depression and suicidal feelings, and her gloomier meditations in the aftermath of the war echoed that part of her personality. She later wrote about how she had become possessed in those days by an overwhelming fear that all her struggles had been for nothing, that there were no greater lessons to learn from all the experiences that she had lived through: Suzanne's suicide attempt, their home plundered, illness, death. In the months after the war, they even had to put their beloved cat to sleep. Lucy likened herself in her reminiscences to a repeat offender Lazarus, rising from the dead over and over, only to witness still more suffering. Throughout the years that followed, she wrote about the war in lengthy letters to friends and in early drafts of what might have become a memoir had she lived longer. These writings were not the sort of quest for personal identity that she had composed as a young woman in the 1920s and 1930s under the name Claude Cahun, but were rather an attempt to make sense of what the war and their time in prison had meant in broader, more universal terms, despite her underlying fear that there was no such meaning to be made. But there had been a point to what they did. Lucy wrote in a 1950 letter, "From July 1940, the invasion of Jersey, until May 1945, the liberation of the Channel Islands, yes, even in prison, even in secret, I wrote to encourage men, including the German soldiers, to liberate themselves." And whether such self-liberation took place was easy to doubt. Yet there were occasional glimpses of something that might offer a larger perspective, and a sense, perhaps, of vindication. In January 1946, for example, Suzanne received a letter in German from a POW military hospital. It was from Heinrich Ebers, one of the men who had guarded Lucy and Suzanne in prison. Surely German jailers did not typically write to their former inmates. His family was alive and in good health, he reported, and the British were treating him well. He asked Suzanne to greet Lucy and to write him back. In some strange way, perhaps Heinrich, the German guard, had liberated himself and wanted them to know it. Lucy and Suzanne had liberated themselves through their resistance work too. Lucy in particular had struggled with the question of identity her whole life, from her youth in an assimilated Jewish household during the heat of the Dreyfus Affair, to her struggles with her mother's mental illness and her own poor health. Her early writings as Claude Cahun were inwardly focused and tortured, an extended attempt to answer the question, "Who am I?" which neither her book nor her evolving self-presentation, her numerous aliases, and her radical politics could ever seem to resolve. She was always looking for more. Lucy finally found her identity through The Soldier with No Name, and so did Suzanne. The war was the one moment in their lives when they seemed to have the strongest sense of purpose and the most direct vision about who they wanted to be. Against the Nazis, there was a moral clarity and certainty, which their earlier work did not always have. The Soldier with No Name finally liberated them to speak as loudly and distinctly as they wanted. Well, those are the end of my remarks, and we can discuss a little bit if you like. I just wanted to point out I've got a few more upcoming events, all virtual. If you're interested in hearing more, you can tune in to any of those. They're all on my website, jeffreyhjackson.com, and you can find out more about that. And of course, remember, signed copies of the book for sale at Dog-Eared Books Castro. Always great to support a local bookseller. So, Lee, do I need to unshare my screen?
I'll do that for you.
Or you can do that. Okay, great. You're in charge. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that. Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore are two of my favorite figures from queer history. I really enjoy them, and I'm excited that your book looks at this very specific point in their lives, because I think a lot of people mostly focus on their art. So please, folks in our various chats on YouTube and Facebook, please feel free to add your comments and any questions you have for Jeff. We have plenty of time if you would like to spark up a conversation or ask any questions. And if not, I've got a couple of questions of my own, and we could always, close up whenever we feel like the conversation has closed up. We have a wonderful comment here from Susan Abbott, just saying thank you, and a wonderful and inspiring story.
Thank you so much.
And we've got a question from Daniel Bao right up here. So how did you come across Lucy and Suzanne's stories?
It's a great question. And the way I came across their stories initially was just how, like most people have, really, is through the photography, through their photographs. And, I showed you a few, and of course you can find many more on the internet. But there was also a personal connection for me in that the person who really first told me about Cahun and Moore's work was my wife. My wife is an art historian, and she has taught the history of photography for many years. And she said, you need to look at these photographs. They're really interesting. And she knew a little bit about the story of their resistance against the Nazis, but she didn't know much because not much really has been written about that until my book. And so I started looking at it, and I said, yeah, I really do need to know more. That first of all, just to find out about the images, but then to find out about what they did during the war period. And then as I worked on it, I started to really see the links and to see the connections between their time in Paris and their time on Jersey in the war. But as I say, it like so many people, I came to them through the images that really drew me in and made me want to learn more and to know more. So that's how I came to the stories. And then once I started investigating, then I spent a lot of time in archives, as all historians do, both in Jersey. Also, there's a large chunk of the documents that are mostly Suzanne's work, actually, that are at Yale University. And so I spent a great bit of time at Yale in their special collections archive. And then I also spent some time in London, in the National Archives in London, looking in particular at declassified military intelligence files, MI19 files, that has really interesting information about Jersey during the occupation. So all of these sources really casting a wide net and trying to pull everything together. And so that's kind of a little bit of the backstory. I do have a section in the book where I kind of tell more of the story behind the story, as I call it. And so I sort of go into greater detail, but I definitely have to give my wife credit for turning me on to their story in the first place.
That's great. Does anyone else in the chat have some questions? I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Do you have a favorite piece of work by the two of them? I know there's a couple of really, really striking images that I resonate with. One of which is just one of my favorites is the "Don't Kiss Me, I'm in Training."
Exactly.
And I think there was an artist a few years ago who did a recreation of that series.
Right, I believe it was Gillian Waring.
Seen their work.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. You see so many of the same photographs over and over again. I think in part because those really are such powerful images. I think that people have seen the one, especially the one of Cahun in what I call the Harlequin coat, that checked coat, looking in the mirror. And in the book, I talk a little bit about that and sort of drawing on this comic figure of the Harlequin. It's what I think that she's doing there. That's, of course, a very powerful one. And what's interesting about that photograph is that, often that photograph gets cropped. In my PowerPoint, I actually showed you the full image. And if you notice very carefully, in the background, there's sort of like a file cabinet or something in the background. And on that file cabinet, or whatever it is, a dresser, I can't remember, is a photograph. And in that photograph is Marcel Moore. And I think what's interesting is that when that photo gets cropped, Moore gets cropped out. And so you don't see the fact that they're both actually in that photo. In a similar way to, as I showed the photo of the two of them, or it looks like it's just Cahun with the Star of David around her neck. I don't know if you look carefully, you see right up above and the top of the image, there's sort of a very faint Moore sort of peeking over the backdrop. And so to me, those two photos are very interesting because they're well known, but only when you see the full image do you actually see that both of them are in both of those very famous images. Like I say, they tend to get cropped. So that, to me, that's one of the many, many things that spoke to me about the collaborative element of this. And I think sometimes that's often overlooked. Most of these images get credited to Claude Cahun, and they're not doubly credited. And in my opinion, and other scholars have argued this too, that really we should talk about their entire body of work as collaborative. So I mean, I definitely love both of those images. I also love the I Am in Training, Don't Kiss Me series, the weightlifter image, series.
There's so many things from Disavowals too that just really get at a sense of disjointedness and I love looking at their more surrealist images that are as someone who, is genderqueer themselves, really gets at the heart of a lot of contradictory experiences and feelings all kind of jammed into one space, which I've always been really interested in their work.
Right, absolutely. And the sense of fragmentation and that's something that's very much of that moment as well. I mean, the surrealists were all sort of interested in those same kinds of questions because this was all in the aftermath of World War I. And so there was a real kind of anxiety about the fate of, the human body after the war and everything that society had been through, that people had been through. That feeling of fragmentation was something that a lot of people were grappling with. And then you add on to it the gender aspect as well, and the identity aspect that's very clear to me in looking at the sources that they are also thinking through. It's almost like they never fully come to an understanding of that, or they're always working on that sense of identity over the course of their lives. And they sort of say as much in a lot of the sources, but you're right, it definitely comes through from that moment in those very fragmented images.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work that they did around masks too. Some of their earlier work before, I think even before Paris. We've got some other questions in here. We've got Josh Thomas asking, can you talk about the challenges of taking the facts that you gather in the course of your research and weaving it into a compelling narrative? Your book is so unique in that it reads less like a biography and more like a narrative story, almost novelistic.
Right, and I it's a great question, and it's definitely a challenge. It's very much like putting a puzzle together, and that was even more so, I think, about this project compared to other projects that I've worked on, in part because of the way that some of the documents exist. First of all, Cahun's writing is very stream of consciousness, and the French is very difficult. It's some of the most difficult French that I've ever had to translate. And it doesn't flow. It's often very obscure exactly what she's talking about. So trying to figure that out. Moore's work, or Suzanne's work, the stuff in particular that's at Yale, was very difficult because what she would do, and she was clearly doing this after the war, later in life, some of the documents are clearly the backs of an envelope or the backs of a calendar. She was jotting these notes on, trying to write down her experiences. And what she would often do is she would write a couple sentences and then she would draw a line, and then she would write a couple more sentences and then draw another line, and then write a few more sentences and then draw another line. But none of the things in any of those sections were related to one another. They were all separate thoughts. So she was, I don't know why she did it this way, but she was sort of writing pieces of the story literally on the same page. And so taking all of those pieces, and that's what I mean when it really was, it felt a lot more like putting a puzzle together, and then trying to figure out, how to find the through line, how to make sure that this was making sense logically as a story using their own words. And then also bringing in the historical context. I mean, I am a historian, I'm an academic historian by training. And so I wanted to also make sure to give enough of the context, the historical context, to put them in a bigger story. So finding the balance there is also tricky because you want to keep the story moving. But the academic side of me, the writer of me wants to keep the story moving. The academic in me wants to make sure that there's all this context so that people understand what's going on and get the bigger picture. So it's definitely a balance, and it's a challenge, but I hope that it has worked out. Folks who are reading the book are telling me, that they seem to think it works really well. I've gotten a lot of great reviews so far, and great comments from folks. So, you can judge for yourself if I was successful, but it was 7 years in the making too. That's the other thing. It's just sort of hammering that out day after day for a long time. And hope, like I say, hopefully it works.
I think it works very well. Next one we've got from Sharon Kewer Davenport. Can you say something about the liberation philosophies of the Moore Cahun zeitgeist?
Well, I think that this idea about self-liberation that they're talking about, or this idea of liberation, of wanting the soldiers to liberate themselves, that I showed in that quote on the screen, I think, to me, one of the things that's really remarkable about this story is that even when they're behind bars, but even before that, when they're writing these notes to the German soldiers, they, I think, really saw it as an act of rescue. I think that what they were trying to communicate to these soldiers essentially was, you are being fooled by Hitler. You are being trapped yourself by this man who is lying to you. And what they were trying to do in the notes was to help those soldiers understand that, to see that they were being lied to. And so the hope then was that by planting those seeds, by planting those thoughts through their notes, again, with this voice of a German soldier, supposedly, this fictional German soldier that they created, the idea was that the soldiers who read the notes would see that and would think about it, and would start to think critically about it. And through that process, that they would come to see the light. And that in doing so, Lucy and Suzanne would have rescued them, in a sense. So I think that for me, what's so amazing about this is that they really had a kind of sense of radical empathy towards the enemy. Something that most people don't do, especially during wartime. But to see the soldiers as themselves, as another type of victim of a horrible philosophy or ideology of fascism, and to try to point that out. In the book, I talk about this idea that Lucy, as writing as Claude Cahun, had articulated back in the Paris days. Cahun had written this work, this essay, and in it it's an essay about the role of art in politics. It's sort of her theory about how artists should engage in politics. And what she basically says is that propaganda is too blunt. It doesn't work because it just creates a sort of emotional reaction. Instead, she says, she calls her idea the indirect effect. That's the phrase that she uses, the indirect effect. And for her, what that meant was not this kind of blunt emotional response of propaganda, but the idea of sort of planting a seed with a poem, with a piece of art, with a song, music, that would stir up critical thinking, so that it might take a while, it might take longer than that blunt emotional response of propaganda, but that over time it would kind of work its way into someone's consciousness. So that was in the 30s. She was already thinking about that even before they went to Jersey. They didn't know, of course, that on Jersey they would actually have an opportunity to put that into practice. But it was something that Cahun in particular had thought about for a while, and then they did end up putting that into practice. But for them, I think it was part of this broader kind of sense that that artists do have a role to play, but that in particular within the context of the Germans on Jersey, that these were men who needed rescuing. And so a lot of the notes were about telling these men, why are you here? You should be back at home with your family. You should be protecting your wife and your children. You should be, there's no reason for you to be here. Sort of appealing to their human side, appealing to their humanity, to their humaneness. And even in prison, they continued building those kinds of relationships. One of the things that's remarkable to me about this story too is that in prison, the prison parts of the book are not, it's not what you would expect from a typical Nazi jail, right? There are no beatings, there are no tortures. There's not this kind of, a sort of violence that we would expect. Instead, they come to these kind of working relationships with the guards. And I think, again, it's part of this desire to reach out to those guards, to touch the humanity in them, to create this idea of self-liberation. Now, I hasten to say that they suffered deeply during their time in prison. Just because they weren't physically abused or tortured doesn't mean that they didn't suffer. In fact, they suffered every day, because every day they believed that this was their last day. They were, there was a deep psychological torment, and that's very clear in the documents. It's very clear in what they write about it, that they literally expected waking up every day thinking this is our last day. They did not expect to survive the war. And so, but yet in the midst of that, even with that going on, they're still somehow reaching out to these men to try to invoke this or help evoke this kind of self-liberation. So it's a really remarkable story and a kind of remarkable philosophy on their part. It comes out of, I think, their own, just their own sense of the human experience. Which I think they also write a lot about, and certainly, as they're making sense of the war in some of those letters and post-war reminiscences, it's really, this desire to kind of, at a human level, to make sense of all this. So I just, every time I talk about it, I continue to be sort of amazed. And like I said, I've been thinking about this for many years, but it still kind of, really just amazes me even to this day. Thanks for that question. That's a great question. I can't hear you, Lee.
Still getting used to this platform. Thank you for that question, Sharon. And it looks like that is the end of our questions in our chat, unless anyone wants to put anything in there. I guess I will ask one question in the meantime, and then we can kind of call it a night. And I know it's it's later for you. You're in Central Time.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you for staying up with us this evening. But I would want to say, what is the most surprising thing that kind of took you? What is the thing that took you the most by surprise when you were doing your research and discovering this element of their story?
That's a great question, because there's so many surprising things actually about this. In some ways, one of the things that was surprising to me was how these actions of writing notes, and they did other things too. It wasn't just notes. As I talked about the banner, I referred to the wooden crosses. There's a point at which when soldiers are being buried, the place where the cemetery where soldiers were being buried was literally just yards, a few yards from their house. They could see it from their house. And so they created this this action where they would create these wooden crosses, and then Suzanne and German would write on them, "For him the war is over." And Lucy would run in the night, in the dark, and kind of stab these wooden crosses into their graves, so that when other soldiers were visiting their fallen comrades, they would see this sort of memorial to them. Wow. But it was a kind of a way of saying, like, he's the lucky one, right? He doesn't have to worry about this anymore. So with all of those kinds of things, one surprising thing is how these seem like small actions, but they're not. They really seem to have big consequences. Like I said, the secret police track them for years. If these really were small and meaningless actions, the police would have just said, forget it.
They wouldn't have admitted it. Yeah.
Yeah, but they know, the police understand that this this is such a strategically important area, that there cannot be any dissent in this area. And in fact, there were other people doing other kinds of actions of dissent. They were not alone. I should point out that there were other residents of Jersey doing this, and a lot of them, Cahun and Moore, ended up meeting in prison because other people were being put in prison. But the other surprising thing to kind of go along with that is that these small acts were not that small, but that they escalated. They continued to escalate over the course of the war. So as you read in the book, they start out with notes, and then they move on to these other things like crosses, like a banner. They snuck down to the beach to try to pass messages to these slave laborers, these men who had been brought from Central Europe and brought to the Channel Islands to build the Atlantic Wall, and were living in a slave labor camp, which was also just a few yards from their house.
Yeah.
That they would sneak down to the beach and try to talk to these men and try to slip them food, so that there was this kind of escalation, and them having so much to lose, as French citizens living as expatriates on Jersey, Lucy having Jewish family, as a lesbian couple, that also put them in danger. And also as artists, doing the kind of art that the Germans back in Germany had called degenerate art. I mean, there's the very famous degenerate art show in the 1930s where the Nazis put all of this, what they consider to be horrible modernist art, on display, and they make fun of it, and they destroy a lot of it. That was the same kind of art that Lucy and Suzanne, Cahun and Moore were making. And so the fact that with so many possible reasons to not do this kind of work, they still did it anyway, and they escalated over the course of the war. And to me, I just think that's really remarkable. And that's why I said in my remarks that most people don't become resistors. Sometimes when I'm teaching about this, I ask students, like, how many of you think you would have stood up and fought the Nazis? And of course, everybody likes to think that, but in reality, most people probably wouldn't. And in fact, historically speaking, most people didn't. So the fact that women like them with so much to lose went ahead and did it anyway, and kept doing it for so long, and kept escalating. To me, I every time I think about it, I think what a remarkable story, and what a remarkable life that they lived. We have talked, people have written so much about their artwork and that period in Paris in the 20s and 30s. That's amazing just by itself. And then you add to it this period during the war, and you realize, their whole lives from birth to death were really this sort of amazing story. And so I hope that, by kind of highlighting the war aspect, or the wartime part of their story, that it really helps to kind of round out and help us to just know more about these two people who were already doing amazing things. And it just is even more surprising when you put it all together. Yeah,
I definitely, since learning about them, have continually said, okay, where's my movie? Where's my movie? This is something that would turn into such an amazing narrative, almost in some ways heist-like.
Right.
So
that's right. Well, fingers crossed. Maybe
queer filmmakers out there, please make this happen, just for our sake.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Put a message up from a friend on the screen. just so you can see it and everyone can see.
Thanks so much, Greg. It's great to hear from you, and we need to be back in touch. Let's get in touch and talk.
And then we've got, so just as a reminder, folks, you can order a signed copy of Paper Bullets from Dog-Eared Books, our wonderful local bookstore in the Castro. We partner with them for several book events. So we've got some, they have some signed book plates that Jeff sent over. So when you purchase a book from them, you'll get essentially a signed copy. And I hope that you all have a good evening. And you can check out more of our events at glbthistory.org. And thank you again, Jeff, and everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.